Hello, I'm Toycat, and welcome back to my second channel geography video. This is our series where we talk about geography and the world and stuff. And this is Google Maps. You're probably familiar with it. It divides the world up into 193 sovereign nations, and it tells you which bit of territory belongs to which nation. And that seems like it's obvious. Like, yeah, it's the most useful map of the world because it shows you where all the countries are. But what it actually shows you is which countries politically claim to have control and is generally backed up by the world of a certain area. This area politically belongs to Kazakhstan. This area politically belongs to Moldova. This area politically belongs to, okay, Google Maps doesn't even try here, right? So it's a political map of the world which already distorts your viewpoint, and then it can't even do that job because it can't decide whether Egypt or Sudan owns Wow. And the actual story behind that, whole nother day. It's a piece of land that neither country claims as theirs, and that's why Google Maps doesn't give it to one of them. But there's this very interesting thing where Google Maps is trying to be a political map of the world, but even then it fails in a few places. I mean, look at the border between India and China if you want to try and work out where one country ends and another begins, and you realize that this is a bad way to divide the world, not just because it doesn't work at what it's trying to do, but also because it lacks all of the context that actually makes the world interesting. For instance, the economies of countries, the military size of countries, the population, arguably, where the people actually live is not represented here in the slightest. Canada looks huge, but has a population smaller than that of California. There's a lot of interesting examples we could talk about, but let's start by dividing the world into two. Let's just do a nice simple job. 12 separate times we're going to be dividing the world into two sets of countries to help you realize a little bit more context about the world map. And if we're dividing the world in two, we have to start with the most literal interpretation. Did you know if you divide the world at the equator, i.e. you literally cut the earth into halves, you would have far fewer countries in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere. This is something you can see when you look at the world, like, oh yeah, the equator's on the map the whole time, but you never really focus on it. There are so many more countries in the northern hemisphere, so many more people, and so many, so much more landmass in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. Even when we count the kind of borderline countries that, like Brazil, or like, it literally counts France, by the way, because of its overseas territories. When you count countries like that, it's like, oh yeah, there is a few more countries, but still very, very few. Most of the world's countries live in the northern hemisphere, and that's why you might assume things like seasons are universal. It's summer right now, right? No, not if you live in Australia, it's not. Not if you live in New Zealand, it's not. It is winter there and has been for a while. But sadly, because again, less than 1/7 of the population lives in the bottom hemisphere, very few people know about these places, and that's why you might assume seasons are universal when they're not. There's a whole other way of life on the other side of that equator that people forget about a lot. Speaking of a whole other side of life, when you drive your car, you might assume that it's brum brum goes fast on the same side of the road everywhere, but did you know in the UK we drive on the other side of the road? Wow, so interesting. And it's funny when Americans go the wrong side. But no, if you look at this map of the world, you can see how the world is divided, with most countries driving on the right, but quite a few driving on the left. You can see how the left-hand side countries generally cluster together. So here's the UK, here's Ireland, clustered together. Here is India and Pakistan and Bhutan. There's a big cluster around there. Then you can see Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, which is surprising to me, drives on the left, Papua New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand. All these countries are kind of linked together. And then South Africa, there's another cluster there. All the countries which drive on the left generally border countries which drive on the left. Countries which drive on the right generally border countries which drive on the right. There have been some exceptions, but they generally changed over history. Sweden used to drive on the left to kind of be against the international trend. They stopped that, and as a fun fact, their road safety went way up for a little bit because people were so scared about driving on the wrong side. Because here's another interesting fact, that when you look at this map, you might be like, oh yeah, so this is just British colonies, right? For some reason, the Brits drove on a different side to the rest of the world, and it kind of caught on. But interestingly enough, if you look at it some more, you can realize that, like, wait a minute, my favorite British colony of Indonesia, my favorite British colony of Thailand or Japan, and it starts to get a bit more complex as to why countries drive on the side of the road they do. Another interesting little tidbit here for you is the country on every continent, because it's, again, it seems like clusters, but there is a country on every continent which has left-hand side driving. You can see how there's British overseas territories in North America driving on the left. Guyana drives on the left, and I think Suriname, I could be wrong, drives on the left. We can see how South Africa, etc., drives on the left. It's a very interesting trend across the world to see, and also because you might think like, oh, so this is just a road law. Why does this matter? This affects so many different things, from how people, like when I cross the street, I look right and then I look left. I think that's how I do it. Or left then right. Again, it's flipped depending on which country I go to. I have to retrain myself when I go to America. look one way, then look the other. I guess it'd be you look right in America. No, you look left in America first, then right. You look. That's how you do it in most of the world, not in the UK. The steering wheel is on a different side in my country to perhaps in yours. And as a result, whenever I get an Uber, again, usually in America, but sometimes in Europe, I sometimes get on the wrong side and it's like embarrassing and they think I'm trying to steal their car. This is a fun thing you don't realize, but this map shows it off. Also as a fun fact, because again, it seems like island nations have a higher propensity to do whatever they like, regardless of their neighbors. Fun fact, isn't that interesting? But also, just a little tidbit while we're here anyway. Let's just mention that, hey, did you know that when you drive on one side, it affects like a whole bunch of other things, and generally, left-hand side countries are safer. Yeah, let's start a debate about that. Or, instead, we could talk about this. This map, I promised to explain what it was in my last video. This is a map of the world divided into two, and inside this circle is the same population. It's actually a great population, but it's more fun to say it's the same. Inside this circle is the same population as outside this circle. This continent, this continent, this continent, this continent, this continent, and even a healthy bit of this, like about half by land area of Asia, if you add all of them together, you get about the same population as all of the others combined. That is something people don't really realize sometimes. Like when you look at a world map and all of the land area, ignore the circle, you're like, yeah, people are probably pretty evenly spread. I mean, no one's on Antarctica, and Australia probably is pretty narrowly spread, and so is Canada, but you don't really realize just how sparsely populated some countries are and how densely populated others are. Again, Hong Kong, very densely populated. Japan, very densely populated. And as a result, when you add all of these high population countries together, India and China between them have 1/3 the world population. So when you add in Indonesia and when you add to Thailand, etc., you start to get to 3.8 billion, whatever the half the world population is, real fast. And this circle, as a technical on a technical level, is going to be shrinking for the next while, and then eventually it's going to shift to the left as Africa starts to become a bigger and bigger force in global population. But fun fact, this circle has the same population as outside of it, which blows my mind because the average human being therefore lives somewhere in this circle. The average human experience is not what you think it is, like, oh yeah, go to work, be oppressed by whatever thing that you found on the way there, and how bad it is to live in the West because this sure is life. No, the average life is growing up in rural India and working on your parents' farm or whatever else. It's obviously there's a lot of industrialization in those countries that is happening, but to this day, a lot of people grow up in crazy rural situations in the middle of a continent that you might not have even visited, and that's crazy how little our human experience, like speedometer, is adjusted to that. Speedometer, I'm sticking with that phrase. Next one, we have countries that have a higher GDP per capita, PPP, purchasing power parity. So basically, to adjust for exchange rates, just because the pound went down 20% against the dollar, my lifestyle didn't go down 20% against the dollar because I buy things in pounds. India, for instance, has a very devalued currency, but they still have a lot of things that are cheaper there. When you adjust for that, here are the countries with a higher GDP per capita than the world average. And there's immediately just like, isn't it interesting that you look at the US and Canada, really just North America, Europe, and then Australia, and then out of everything else is like kind of spattered around. There is, obviously China is there, Japan's there, South Korea. Interestingly, North Korea is not on this map. I wonder what they did so differently to their southern neighbor. But you can see looking around here like, oh, yep, Middle East has some money. You can see like south of South America and north of North America, very, very good. Interestingly, Cuba, not on the map, but a lot of other Caribbean nations are. But yeah, if you look at this map, you see a lot of very interesting things about where where the wealth actually is in the world in terms of where people actually make the money. Let's think of income, not wealth. And yeah, I also think that like the interesting thing in Europe is the exceptions, in the sense that only Ukraine, Moldova, like Serbia, and I think Bosnia are below the average, and also Montenegro. Whereas when you go to Africa, the interesting thing is the exception on the other level. No African nation is at that level besides I think that's Equatorial Guinea. I'm awful at this one. And also Botswana. And Botswana's a really interesting case for a country that is, again, it's very little known about. It's super sparsely populated. 2 million people live here, despite the fact that 60 million people live here, for instance. There's a fun fact for you. But yeah, 2 million people live in this whole country, and the country is the longest lasting democracy in Africa. And you might be like, wow, longest lasting democracy? When does it go back to? 1966. And the money they make there, like, I thought it was like, again, gonna be like a Rwanda situation where they're trying to like modernize the industry, try go the Middle East route. It's like, oh no, they have a lot of diamond mining and stuff like that, but they have such a low population that it spreads out to be very high per person. And it's like, you know what? You gotta take your wins where you can get them, I guess. Also, as a fun fact, lots of island nations, I think the Seychelles and the Maldives, are both, interestingly enough, above the world average, and they're technically African nations, but they're like islands off Africa. Anyway, fun fact to go with Soy Cat. This is, again, an interesting one to look at to make you realize where the wealth in the world is kind of concentrated. These are the key players in terms of how they can actually project their ability in the world, because economics is the new military, I would argue. I'd argue economics is related to military, and it's related to how you can show your strength in the world. This is why these countries will always be more influential than these countries. Sorry to say that, Brazil, again, with an insane population, but how much do you think about it? Perhaps not too much. Here are countries in pink that the British Empire has invaded, and here are countries in purple that the Britain has not invaded. So I needed to show this one because it's fun. Like, look how few countries the UK has invaded. But again, even if you use the loosest definition of invade, because invade has a very tight technical definition, even if you use the loosest definition of invade, you'll realize that this isn't actually correct. Like, wait, the UK has invaded Kazakhstan? You need a really, really loose definition where you're like, oh yeah, the UK had a thing against the Russian Empire at one point in Crimea or something. There's a lot of very loose justifications for all these sorts of things. Like, the UK never invaded China, but we did steal one of their ports, and then we forced them to sign it over to us. And when they didn't give it over to us, we put opium in their country. But we didn't invade in a traditional sense. Although maybe you think Hong Kong's an invasion. Maybe you love what's happening there right now. But maybe instead we could talk... Again, I just want to clarify. Interesting map. Not very accurate, but fascinating regardless, right? Good job, purple countries. Which, interesting enough, if you look at the purple countries, the reason they weren't invaded is mostly because they're landlocked. Like, here's the landlocked countries of the world. Every country in red does not have direct access to the sea. Isn't it interesting just how few countries do not have access to the sea? With 193 sovereign nation states, of those 193, you can see how just these few do not have access to the sea. And of those few, most of them are pretty recently independent. Belarus, independence, 1991. Kazakhstan, independence, 1991? It might be 1990. Mongolia, actually, you know, Mongolia's been independent for a while, but mostly because neither Russia nor China wanted the other to have it, so they made it an independent state. Countries that are landlocked rely on their non-landlocked neighbors, because the number 1 resource we have to send things, to make trade, which again is the number 1 thing we do as humans, to make anything happen in the world. But that relies on the number one resource. It's free. It's a sea. You just send boats on it, and they can collect things. And yeah, so as a result, red nations are generally less connected, and generally the only way they can exist is because they have some form of river, a lot of rivers that are navigable within them, and that is what makes them kind of work. And so in some cases, it's just like, man, these are very recent countries that rely on their neighbors. If their neighbors want them dead, they will stop existing. Bhutan is an example of this. You know, Bhutan's a cool country, but you know, if India or China, if India and China both agreed they would not exist, poof, into thin air they would go. And this is a sad reality of geopolitics that is still true right now, even in an era where you think, oh yeah, but we use planes, not boats. No, we use boats for the vast majority of shipping, and also for the vast majority of transport, because air is pretty well controlled. Anyway, next map here. This is a split between more economically developed countries and less economically developed countries. Again, there's this fascinating thing where the north of the world is not only where most of the countries are, but the north of the world is where most of the wealth is. Again, there's always some lazy justification like, oh yeah, so like colonialism? So like the blue countries stole the wealth from the red countries, ignoring like, oh yeah, all of the famous Serbian colonies, all of those famous, you know, like Ukrainian colonies, literally a part of the Russian Empire. You know, like so many like the vast majority of countries in Europe didn't have major colonial presence. But like if you ignore that, it's like, okay, so what's the justification here? And it's really hard to be certain. There's a billion theories, and every time you mention one of them, someone shoots it down as like pew pew controversial. Like, oh yeah, being a colder country leads to more success. It has been Again, that is the thing that lines up there. But it's like, no, I don't think that is true. I'm not going to look at facts and data. I'm going to insert my emotions here. And if I'm going to be allowed to use my emotions, I'm going to say all countries in blue that I visited, with maybe Russia. Actually, no, I've been to Moscow. Maybe outside of that, it's kind of true. The blue countries are really nice countries. The red countries, you feel like you're in danger all the time. Actually, wait, is that true? Not Thailand. Not Thai. Of the ones I've been to, Thailand is the exception to that rule. Thailand should be blue. You know what? They made a little exception for Taiwan, for South Korea, for Japan, and Singapore. Let's grab and let's get Thailand in there. They're like middle income, it's generally considered. And but yeah, that's my way of dividing the world. Way more controversial than anything else that I've said today. But you know what isn't controversial? The list of countries that have hosted the Olympic Games. I know that the Olympics have been around forever, so I was shocked to learn that it was only a handful of countries, interestingly enough, almost perfectly lining up with that previous list. Except China's obviously here now instead, like as well. Eastern Europe just did not host Olympics, mostly because they, for the last 100 years, they've only existed for about 30 of them, so makes sense most of them haven't gotten around to hosting an Olympics yet. You can see how Brazil is very nicely managing to host its own Olympics. And you can also see how, like, oh yeah, there's Australia. Go you guys. I guess they're including the thing from earlier. Basically, a handful of countries have the Olympics, and it kind of just rotates around. And that's fascinating, in my opinion, that, like, even something like an international sporting event, because it requires spending, quite a lot of it, in fact. Most Olympics make no money. It's like a prestige thing. You spend money and you host the world. Around your house. It literally is that, actually. It's literally invite the world around your house, and it's fascinating in that way, in my opinion. Also, it's fascinating to me that Finland had the Olympics. I need to look into the Helsinki Olympics. I'm very interested. But also, Denmark hasn't, and neither has Portugal, which, as we all know, is Eastern Europe or Western Europe. So maybe that's why. Speaking of things you know why, here are unitary states and federal states. I know, I said I was dividing the world into two, and as soon as I do, you're just fascinated about the purple country. It's the first thing you look at. I know. I feel you too. We're not going to mention Somalia, though. Why aren't we going to mention Somalia? Is it because they've got a federal government that's a unilateral government? Who knows for sure? You can look into Somalia if you want to. Leave your theory in the comments down below. Why are they purple? But yeah, this is countries, federal countries draw power from the ground up. Powers that are not reserved, powers that are not explicitly given to the federal government are reserved by the states. In blue countries, power is given down. Powers that are not explicitly given to the the individual parts are reserved by the country within them. Within the United States, if a state wants to do something not explicitly reserved in the Constitution or whatever other laws, then that belongs to the states. This is, I think, the 10th Amendment. I read all the amendments to the American Constitution recently, just so I can be like, I'm a smart guy who knows Constitution amendments online. But anyway, so it's the 10th one, I'm pretty sure, that's like, you can't do things that are like that. And that means that if you are a state and you want to be like, you know what, over here, I want to make it so that there is a tax on... you can't, actually, there is like a discrimination thing. I was going to be like, a tax on insert group here. If you want to be like, there is no cats allowed in Oregon, you can do that. If you want to be like, hey, this is the Massachusetts Republic, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Over here, we don't allow money. You're not allowed money in or out. There is a hard border. You get checked for your money before you go into another state. That's probably legal. Someone tell me if that's not. It definitely breaks one of the constitutional laws. Anyway, so you can see how Europe is very much a unitary place, with Germany, Austria being very interesting exceptions. You can see how China, interestingly unitary, and you can see how even the UK, which is officially a country of countries, is a unitary state. The UK has the powers. There are federal devolved powers for like Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, but in reality, those powers are explicitly given by the UK government. Same with Spain. Spain is like a weird federation that is a unitary state. There's a lot of very interesting things we could talk about, including this purple case, but what if instead we talk about third world countries? I wanted to, so I think I mentioned this before, I want to make a whole video about third world countries which made it to the first world, but the problem with defining the third world, the reason this isn't a dividing into two things, is because the third world, the first world is countries aligned with the US and its allies, NATO allies, let's call them. The second world is like, the Warsaw Pact and their allies. So, there was like a big Cold War between those two. The third world was just countries that are not aligned in that conflict. But because most countries that the US or Russia didn't court to their side, because those countries are generally, not worth courting to their side, it's seen as like third world country equals not very good place. And I think that's such an interesting like link that we've all made. That again, third world had nothing to do with wealth, but because we've said it for so long, if you ask most people that aren't Cold War nerds, they'll be like, yeah, the third world, that's where all the poor people are at. And they're not entirely wrong for the most sense. Like again, if we compare this map with the which one was it? Not landlocked countries. If we compare this map and then we look at this map, it's like there is a astounding amount of overlap there, right? But yeah, basically, the third world is not countries that are poor or rich. Also, it's just about non-division. But also, you can see how these are non-aligned countries. These are countries that were not aligned in that whole conflict between the US and Russia, officially speaking at least. And it makes you realize that you don't really hear about these countries because you hear about your country and you hear about the countries allied to your country a lot, but you don't hear so much about what's going on in Botswana. That's why when I told you earlier that they had a lot of diamond mining, I was lying. It was mineral mining altogether. Bet you didn't know that. Bet you feel ashamed of yourself now. Did you know 85% of their exports go to the EU? I bet you didn't. That could be a lie. Would it shock you? It probably wouldn't, right? You want to hear about Dr. Congo? No, what you want to hear about is this last map of the world, map number 11. It's NATO and its allies. So in blue, as in dark blue, I don't know why this shows EU countries, but it's the nicest map I could find, okay? So light blue countries are EU countries, not in NATO. Dark blue countries is just NATO countries. So if you look at this map, you can see where 70% in blue, 70% of the world's military spending is done by these countries. The countries covering less than a third of the world's surface area have 70% of the world's military spending. Because all of these countries are officially obliged to defend each other if any other one is invaded, if you are in one of these countries, you don't actually have a real threat of someone sending land force troops, men with guns, into your country, unless other countries like kind of condone it, like, we've been wanting Mexico to invade America for a while. We'll just stand back on that one. Obviously a joke. I want Switzerland to invade France. They need to be taken down a peg. Obviously a joke. But the only real risks are if other countries in the Union all decide not to help you out, as they're obliged if you invoke a treaty. Although America invoked the treaty for 9/11, which doesn't make any sense. But whatever. And I think France invoked it for their recent terror attacks. But again, nothing really came of it. There is an article that you can invoke that means every other country has to defend you, and therefore these are the safest countries in terms of no military invasion. And also, but interestingly enough, the biggest risk is actually another country in NATO invading you, because that clause doesn't apply if America invades Canada, etc., etc. So yeah, the blue zone is the safe zone, and the white zone is where who knows what's up unless you've got nukes going on. And maybe you find that interesting. Or maybe what you find interesting is, because, this is only 11 maps, you want a 12th one. So here is NATO in 2050. As you can see, this is the end. This is NATO's final form, because this is what NATO really is. Even though, officially it's protect the world from devastation, unite all peoples within our nations, NATO and OTAN. Anyway, so officially that's what NATO is. In reality, NATO is just, hey, Russia, chill there. Chill. We know you got nukes. We know you got a lot of military spending. We know you secretly want all your Eastern European countries back, but no. Bad Russia. Bad. And geopolitics explained with bad playground antics. No, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, then watch it again. That's how I should just end this. Just, if you did, start again. When you get to this bit, this is where the new intro will be. Watch this twice, if you really liked it so much. Why won't you do that for me? I thought you loved me. I thought this was all about me and you. No, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it makes you realize that, yeah, you can divide the world into a lot of ways. And those ways are going to tell you so much more information than this. Like what's happening in South Sudan. Do you know it's the world's newest country? Does it tell you that? No. There's a lot of things you don't realize by looking at the world map. If you assume every unit of government is equal, then yeah, knowing that South Sudan is here and that Nepal... Oh, I called Bhutan Nepal earlier. I'm sorry. I got them mixed up. Don't leave a hate comment. This is this is like the geography version of hate. You know what to look at? You said Nepal, and I hate you for that. Also, I think I called Gabon Equatorial Guinea earlier. So we're going through a controversial time today. Look forward to those high quality comments. But no, I hope you'll enjoy this video. If you liked it, then go watch another one or something. I don't know. It's the second channel. I don't really care. What I do care about, though, is you coming and watching this video. Would you like to see a video that takes the, because this map of the world is inherently political, would you like to see an apolitical world map? Because I think that's something we're doing in the near future. But what we're not doing in the near future is saying goodbye, because second channel don't care.